Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 240, and this time we're talking about Astrud Gilberto's debut album from 1965, the Astrud Gilberto album. This is not an original 65 pressing, it is a late 70s French repress which has a very French photograph on it of young women running across the beach, maybe with no pants on. Very French. And that's fine, but I always think that the original photo of Astrud has a certain je ne sais quoi. Astrud Gilberto is, of course, a singer who turned the classic record Get Gilberto from a really good album, jazz, bossa nova mashup, into a classic record which makes a lot of people's top 10 jazz records ever. In the process, she also made Flat Affect sexy from a singing point of view. Unsurprisingly, this is an album full of bossa nova tracks. She would go on to include pop and jazz in her repertoire, but here she's very much capitalizing on her fame as a singer of the Girl From Ipanema. Astrud Gilberto was born Astrud Evangelina Weinert in Salvador in Bahia in Brazil in March 1940. Her mother was Brazilian and a school teacher. Her dad was a German immigrant and he was a professor of languages, and Astrud and her two sisters were all named after mythic German goddesses. She inherited the facility for languages from her dad. In addition to Portuguese, growing up she spoke Japanese, French, Spanish, Italian, and English, which would come in handy later. When Astrud was 8, the family moved from Salvador to Rio, and they got an apartment in the Copacabana district on the famous Avenida Atlantica. As we enter the 1950s, this neighborhood in Rio was, of course, the birthplace and the cradle of bossa nova. And as a teenager, Astrud mixed with many of the future bossa nova stars, including Roberto Maniscal and Carlos Lyra. Although she sang socially with friends and family growing up, she was not in any kind of musical career track. Through friends, in particular through Nara Leao, the future bossa nova singer who was very much at the social heart of the whole nascent bossa nova scene in the late 1950s, she ends up getting introduced to João Gilberto. The year they met was 1959, the same year that João had a hit record out, Chega de Saudade. He would court her by playing guitar while she sang, and later that year they got married and pretty quickly began to have a family. In the early 60s, as the bossa nova craze boomed in Brazil, Astrud would regularly sing with João and his friends. She performed once in public, but mostly it was in private. It's funny to think of her as an outsider because her voice, lacking vibrato, very self-conscious sounding, fit perfectly the simple, self-conscious style of bossa nova. And in fact, these days, you'd say she's probably the archetypal bossa nova voice. By 1962, however, the bossa nova craze was starting to diminish a little bit in Brazil, while at the same time it was booming in the US because jazz players like Herbie Mann, Paul Winter, and Charlie Bird had taken these State Department-funded trips to Brazil. They had been struck by this incredible music, and Bird in particular had gone back to the States and had, under the supervision of Creed Taylor at Verve Records, made a great record with Stan Getz called Jazz Samba. That record and the whole US bossa nova craze which followed ends up creating a bit of a Brazilian brain drain from Rio to New York, and musicians followed really where the interest and the money was, and those included people like Antonio Carlos Jobim, the famous composer of so many bossa nova standards, the great bossa nova bassist Tião Neto, the pianist and band leader Sergio Mendes, and the Gilberto family went along as well. And as part of all this, Stan Getz's label Verve Records and his producer, Creed Taylor, invite João Gilberto and Antonio Carlos Jobim to come and record with Stan Getz in March 1963 and make the record which we now know as Get Gilberto. When this is all agreed with Verve, Astrud has no part in these discussions. She's just a spectator to all this. But of course, she eventually becomes involved in the record, and how this happens is a subject of a bunch of different competing narratives. And one of these, according to Astrud, is that it was João's idea. Now, Creed Taylor had wanted to have English lyrics on The Girl From Ipanema. He thought the whole record would sell better as a consequence. The problem was that neither Jobim, nor Gilberto, nor Tião Neto, who was playing bass on the record, nor Milton Banana, who was playing drums, none of these Brazilians could sing in English, but Astrud could. But a different version doesn't actually have João suggesting it. It actually has Astrud suggesting it, and João saying no, but the other guy is saying, actually, she's pretty good, let's let her sing. And another version, which Stan Getz gives after the fact in a series of interviews in 1966, is that it was all his idea, and he was so inspired as to think he wanted to have this innocent-sounding, naive singing this song, but he also, in those interviews, calls her an inexperienced housewife, etc., etc. She took great exception to that characterization. Whichever of these is correct, she of course ends up singing on the record. When the record is done, Taylor then takes the finished version of the Girl from Ipanema, edits it down by removing Joao's verses so that Astrud is a sole singer on the track, and then releases it as a single, and it is a worldwide smash. Astrud herself gets union scale for this, $120. She's barely credited in the album. She's not listed as a performer. So as far as the rest of the world is concerned on these sessions, Astrud is plucked from obscurity and placed right in the center of the bossa nova galaxy. We know, of course, that she has been present at the creation of bossa nova and grown up in the cradle of bossa nova all the way through the 1950s. She knows everybody. She's sung with everybody. She's married the leading exponent of bossa nova. It's hardly that this is novel for her, but that's the way the narrative has gone. She then signs for the remainder of the year as a special guest vocalist with Getz, largely because she needed the money because she and Joao were splitting. He was cycling downhill into depression and anxiety, not getting out of bed, staying in his pajamas the whole time. She needed financial security for her young family, so she agrees to do this. She gigs in the States with Getz. They play Greenwich Village. One of those gigs is actually immortalized on the record Getz A Go-Go. She and Getz also do a movie that fall. You can see clips of her performance in that movie on YouTube. They're all over. They also have a fling, which gets widely reported in the Brazilian media, who are on her case about that because they're blaming her for what's happened to Joao. By the end of 1964, she's had enough of all this. She's had enough of Stan Getz. She goes to Creed Taylor and signs a solo deal with Verve Records. She'd end up making 8 records for Verve over the course of the 1960s, most of which are pretty darn good. And in January 1965, she goes into the studio to make her debut, this record. This record is made January 27th and January 28th, 1965 at RCA Studios in Hollywood, and Creed Taylor is her producer. Astrud Gilberto, of course, is a singer and the star. Antonio Carlos Jobim is also present here. He's playing guitar on much of the record. He also provides backing vocals here and there. The arrangements are done by a guy called Marty Page, who bears responsibility for the string sounds, which you hear ladled quite generously over this record, for better or worse. There's quite a few other musicians on here. The notable ones include Bud Shank, who plays flute and also alto sax. All kinds of cool jazz and hard bop musicians had made a transition, at least temporarily, into bossa nova in recent years. Shank is one of the people who did best at that. In addition to Astrud and Tom Jobim, the Brazilian contingent on this record also includes Joao Donato on piano. He was an old friend of Joao's and Astrud's from the early bossa nova days in Rio. The record's released in May 1965. It gets to number 41 on the Billboard Albums charts, and it was her best-selling solo record. On the record, Gilberto and Taylor play it safe in that the track listing is pretty much all bossa nova standards, many of which are written by Jobim himself. It starts off with a great vocal performance by Astrud on Once I Loved. The next track, and please excuse my Portuguese pronunciation, is Água de Beber, on which Tom Jobim joins Astrud on vocals. If not the definitive version of this song, it's one of the definitive versions, not least because the accompaniment is excellent. Meditation is frankly overproduced, but has some nice flute work from Shank. Then we have a bit of a clunker, and not coincidentally, perhaps, one of the only non-Jobim tracks in the record, and Roses and Roses. Luckily, the next track is O Moro, one of the great bossa nova standards, and this is a great vocal performance by Astrud in front of great accompaniment and some fantastic work from Shank. The side closes with a pretty good performance by Astrud of Insensitez, although, again, the string accompaniment is just a bit unnecessary. Pretty much the same can be said about Dindi, which is the track which kicks off side 2, although the arrangement's pretty interesting here. Then Astrud gives a performance of Photograph, and here she's singing in Portuguese, and frankly, I think the record would have been improved a little bit had she done more of that. She gives a great performance also on Dreamer, and then we come, the second last track on side 2, to a real highlight, possibly the best track on the whole record. This is Sofini de Ser Com Você. This is free of strings, and we are absolutely able to immerse ourselves not just in her voice, but in Williamson's trumpet and Joao Donato's fantastic piano playing. The last track is also Astrud's sole composing credit in this record, a joint composition between herself and Tom Jobim. This is, as a performance, just okay. It suffers in equal measure from the good and the bad parts which afflicted other tracks in this record. This album is a singer's record, and unlike people like Celine Dion or Shirley Bassey, Astrud Gilberto is never going to blow down walls or knock out windows with the sheer power of her voice. Her singing is typically very intimate, very direct, kind of quiet, and so it's a little bit unfortunate that at times the string arrangements here tend to drown her out. I'm left occasionally with a feeling that less might have been more. That said, this is still the voice which had captivated the whole world some months before. This record places her voice at the center of what it's trying to achieve. It's a captivating voice, and for me, this record is 4 to 5 stars.